Would you turn to Daniel chapter 1? Daniel chapter 1. That'll be our main passage today. So Dean and I have now been here over 3 years. It seems impossible that time has passed by that fast. And you know there's a period where you know that you're like in the honeymoon period, right? You get lots of grace, and you know you're in that. But then there's this period that you're going to find out, do you really fit in? Do you really belong here? You know, you've been here for a year, and are you accepted with this church? And there are several things that have happened, particularly the last time I preached and this time, that has made me feel accepted. So the last time that I was going to preach, one of my friends walked in and he said, as he was carrying a large cup of coffee, said, "I heard you were preaching. I brought extra coffee." This morning I was standing out in the foyer, and a couple that I was only 10 feet away, the wife said, "Oh, Tim Ball's preaching today." And the husband said, knowing I could hear him, "Let's go." It wasn't several minutes later before I was wandering over to find my Bible and my notes, and one guy had it and said, "If I hide these, will it only be a 5-minute sermon?" I feel accepted. I feel part of the group. And I just want to say publicly, Michael Langston, Carrie Fender, and Luke Frazier, I hear your love language. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 1, but before, mark that place or put your finger in it and turn over with me to start in 1 John chapter 2, and then we'll go back to Daniel. 1 John chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. John writes, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever." Our culture, our world, has changed in many ways over the years. If I was to ask you this question, how would you answer it? Is our culture more Christian or less Christian than 20 years ago? And then we could go back, some of you can go back and evaluate this. Is our culture more Christian or less Christian than 50 years ago? We see this in many ways. You think about just some of the entertainment, some of the movies that we see, some of the things that are on TV, even commercials, and we find ourselves kind of feeling desensitized. Just things don't offend us that might have offended us 20 years ago or 50 years ago. Now, I don't want to be too dramatic or exaggerate or overstate our situation today, because we still have a lot of freedom to worship our God. But our culture is not the same. The biblical view of family, of marriage, of the value of life, even what is appropriate, is not the prevailing opinion today. It feels like the church is having less and less influence on the culture, and we have to watch the culture's influence on the church. One of the things that I think as we look back, in particularly our country, that we notice, I did a little research because I was curious about when some of these things happened. And I looked back and found out that up until World War I, up through World War I, creationism was what was taught in the schools as far as explaining the origin of life. About the turn of the 20th century, Darwin's theory of evolution became more popular. It started growing in popularity, and so in some schools in the early 1900s, in some schools, they began giving evolution as an alternative to creationism to explain the origin of life. Well, there began to be some lawsuits, and early on, there were states that had laws that said you could not teach evolution in the classroom. That happened often until the 1960s, when the courts decided then that teaching creationism and ignoring or leaving out, lost my place here, where we taught creationism and excluded evolution, they decided that it advanced religion, and schools could no longer require teachers or force teachers to teach creationism and exclude evolution. Now, some places have taken this to great degrees. Texas has said, hey, you have to remain neutral on these subjects. You have to remain neutral on evolution versus creationism. And so really what we have today in the public schools, if it depends on who your teacher is. If you have a Christian teacher in the public schools, your child is more likely to hear about creationism. If not, your child is more likely to hear just evolution. And I'm very thankful for our Christian teachers in public schools who help bring that to the classroom. It's a reason why Christian schools and Christian school attendance and homeschools have been on a steep incline over the last 50 years. Tony Evans, who is a popular preacher in the Dallas area, described it this way. He said, Christians in America have now lost their home field advantage. The church is no longer the home team. They're like the visiting team. It's like you've come into an area and the crowd does not support you. And in a ball game, when the visiting team does something well, there are very few cheers. There's not many in the audience there to cheer them on. There may be some who look at the visiting team and respect the way that they play, but you don't hear many cheers. Usually, if something is done well by the visiting team, you hear silence or groans or maybe even boos. So, the concern about this and the reason a biblical worldview is important is we're like foreigners in a strange land. Now that sounds biblical, right? But there's a human tendency to want to fit in, to be part of the crowd, to be liked. And the world appeals to us and calls to us to join them and not be part of the extremist group. So what do you do? How do you live? What kind of principles do you set? Let's look at Daniel chapter 1. This is a great story for explaining of living in a foreign land when your values conflicts with the culture that you're in. It's also the great story that we just did at VBS. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Now, just a little background of this story of Daniel. So you remember Israel, the nation Israel wanted a king. And God appointed Saul as the first king, and Saul was not such a good king. And then there was David, who was a good king, and Solomon, who was a good king. And then Solomon's son, Rehoboam, started doing some things that the people didn't like, and there was a rebellion, and the nation of Israel split into two nations. One was the nation of Israel, one was the nation of Judah. And the Bible tells a story of these two nations, and there's about 20 kings in each one of them, and the Bible tells about these kings, and it always has an evaluation statement as it talks about these kings, and it says many times they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. A few times they said he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But most of the time in these kings, it said they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so God sent prophets and said, your unfaithfulness hurts me, and I'm going to rise up a nation to enslave you if you do not give your heart to me. And God warned them, and sometimes there was repentance for a period, and many times there was rebellion. So after a while, Israel had king after king after king who did evil, and the Assyrians came and took the nation of Israel. And then there was Judah, who had occasionally some good kings, but it got to where they were having king after king who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so God raised up the Babylonians to conquer Judah because of their spiritual rebellion. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, who had the most powerful nation at this time, wanted to increase his power. And so as he besieged Jerusalem, as he took over the nation of Judah, he took a lot of the vessels out of the temple. And he took them and put them into the temples of his God. But then he also said, I want the best and the brightest. I want you to find the best and the brightest, and I want you to bring them to me, and we're going to train them, and they'll make my country and my nation even stronger. Look at verse 3. So it described youths with no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding, discerning knowledge, who had the ability serving in the king's court. Now, what did King Nebuchadnezzar do with them? Well, he needed to change some things about them. He knew they followed this God, the God of Israel. And so he set about, how do we change this? And they knew how to do that. You get the younger generation, and you begin to teach them things. And so verse 4 at the end says he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated for 3 years, and at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. He's trying to change everything about them. He's taken them from their land, from their culture. He's taken them from their parents. He's trying to change their language, and he's trying to change what they eat. Verse 6, now among them were the sons of Judah. Among them were, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. Now, why did he do that? Well, names often had meanings in those days, and we certainly had meanings here. Daniel's name, the word E-L-L, is a word for God, and Daniel meant God is my judge. Mishael has El, who is like God. Hananiah, the wording Yah, is Jehovah or Yahweh. And so the name Hananiah means Jehovah is gracious. Azariah, Jehovah is my help. So these young boys all had names that told them who God was to them. And so Nebuchadnezzar had them to change their names. And he assigned their names to Daniel, Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, we're familiar with Abednego, right? Here at Fairmont Park, we just call him Abby. Right, kids? That's a VBS reference if you weren't there. He gave them the names that were somehow related to his gods, so he changed their names. Now, if we were reading, as we read this story, and we didn't have the perspective of a God who reigns, if we were just seeing a movie and saw this young men who were taken from their land and they were kind of being brainwashed to learn new things, we'd feel sad and you'd feel kind of hopeless about this situation. But let's see what they do. Verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine from which he drank. Daniel said, I will not defile myself. Now, what does that word mean? What does it mean, I will not defile myself? And we could give several definitions, but I think a great explanation, if you'll turn over to Hebrews chapter 13. We find this same idea used in this phrase about marriage. Daniel chapter 13, verse 4. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. All right. So, in this context, defiling a marriage is being unfaithful. Whether it's one partner, both partners, being unfaithful, throwing away the commitment that two people made to one another, the promise to be together as husband and wife, being unfaithful defiles the marriage. There's something here about the food and the drink with Joseph that said, they're asking me to be unfaithful. Now, it could be a number of things here for Daniel. It could be that they were serving them food that were not part of the list of food that they could have in the Levitical laws, or it may have been some of the foods that were listed that you must abstain from. It could be that maybe they did not cook this food the way God told them to cook their food. They may have done some things different. But more likely, it had something to do with sacrifice to idols. There was something in this process that Daniel said, if I eat this food, I am being unfaithful and I am serving an idol. Something about here, and Daniel said, I will not do it. I believe Daniel was willing to just go on a fast if whatever he needed to be killed if that's what it involved. But what did God do? Daniel's in this predicament. He's not going to do this. He's not going to defile himself. He's not going to do anything that would make him unfaithful to his God. And so what does he do? What does God do in verse 9? Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. And Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Daniel's in a pickle. He's willing to give up his life to stay faithful to God. But God opened the door. Somehow God gave him favor with the official who was overlooking them. Now, I don't know if they just both loved chariots and they got to talking about chariots and had that connection, or what it was that they liked, but there was something that God put this official here with Daniel, and there was a connection, and God opened the door for Daniel to stay faithful to him and still spared his life. One of the things of having a biblical worldview is understanding and sometimes drawing a line and saying, nope, I'm not going there. We know that we are in the world, but we are not of the world. Having a strong biblical worldview understands when there are times that you're just part of a world that you were born into, in a culture that you were born into and have been placed, and there are some times that say, you have to say, this feels like unfaithfulness. This feels like a lack of faith. That's often a scary thing to think of, to say, what if I'm in a position and I have to stand up? Man, persecution, being shunned are not things that I put on my list that I hope happens to me each day. And yet sometimes as we look at where our culture's going, and we're challenged with this idea of having a biblical worldview and ignoring and pushing away the secular worldview, we will have to make decisions along the lines. But here's the good news today. One, we have this example of Daniel. And if you keep reading the story, you know the story about the fiery furnace where they stood up and drew a line and said no. In chapter 6, Daniel said, no, I will pray. I'm going to continue to pray for my God. I'm not going to stop praying because you said, and he drew a line. And God opened doors and rescued them. As we continue this series, and Mike has actually finished the biblical worldview, but he's starting a new series next week that says, how do you know the Bible is trustworthy? If we're going to have a biblical worldview, if we're going to be strong, if we're going to be faithful in our walk, we got to make sure that no matter what kind of questions come up, we can look in God's Word and we are confident of what this says to us. So I'm excited about a new series that Mike's going to start next week about how do you know the Bible is trustworthy. I want to finish today looking at this by going to Romans chapter 8. If you would turn with me there. We may be the visiting team. We may be in a non-supportive crowd. We might even find ourselves in a hostile crowd one day, but we do not despair because we know who God is. And Paul reminds us this in chapter 8 and verse 35. He said, "Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Just as it is written, for your sake we are being put to death all day long. We were considered as sheep to be slaughtered, but in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us." Several versions say we are more than conquerors. More than conquerors. This story of Daniel, they moved out of his culture, put into a new culture. Daniel's faithfulness, as it turned out, he was not influenced by the Babylonian culture, but instead, he influenced that culture and the friends with him. Even one part to where Nebuchadnezzar said, "We will all honor the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego." Our faithfulness, our God, makes us more than conquerors in any and every situation. Today, we want to invite you to join us all as we strive to be faithful, to get a strong biblical worldview. If there's any way we can help you in your walk, if there's any way that we can support you today, we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.